Good afternoon, boys and girls. Welcome to Hospitality Studies. My name is Mpome Zulu, and I will be taking you through into today's lesson. Please have a pen and paper so that you can write notes. In this chapter, we will be focusing on 5 infectious diseases that all food workers should be aware of. Now, you might be wondering, what are foodborne diseases? These are illnesses that can be contracted from consuming food and beverages that are contaminated. We will look at the first 3, which are hepatitis A, gastroenteritis, and cholera. And later on, we will look at HIV and AIDS, as well as tuberculosis. Boys and girls, we will look at 5 fundamentals of each disease: the causes or the sources where they come from. We will look at the incubation period. This is the time between contamination and the appearance of the first symptoms of the disease. We will look at the symptoms. I need to highlight to you that we are only going to focus on the most dominant symptoms that separate each disease from the other. You will find as you go through your notes in your textbooks that there are overlapping symptoms. For example, fever, fatigue, dehydration, and diarrhea, which forms part in all the diseases. So you need to know what symptoms or which symptoms separate each disease from the other. Hence, those are the ones that we'll be discussing. But you need to always keep the other symptoms at the back of your head. Prevention of possible transmission, as well as how it affects the workforce. Now, this area forms part of an evaluation question in the examination where you will be asked to evaluate the impact that it has on the hospitality industry. Now, remember, boys and girls, we are in a service industry and our main aim is to provide goods and services with an aim of having a profit. Now, if any of our employees are affected or infected with any of these diseases, it will ultimately disrupt workflow as well as have a loss of income. Let's look at the first one, hepatitis A. Hepatitis A is a contagious liver disease where the liver becomes inflamed. It is caused by drinking untreated water, eating food that has been prepared by someone who is infected, having close personal contact with someone that is already infected with hepatitis A. It can take between 2 to 3 weeks for the symptoms to show, and the most dominant symptoms are dark yellow urine, as well as yellowish skin and eyes. As you can see on this picture, it is sometimes called jaundice. It can be prevented by drinking bottled water because this water is treated, as well as having a hepatitis vaccine. Gastroenteritis is an intestinal infection. It is caused by consuming contaminated food, being in contact with infected workers, and also drinking infected water, as well as flies which can contaminate the food. Now, a person takes very quick to show symptoms of infection with gastroenteritis. It can take between 1 to 2 days, 24 to 48 hours. And the person can display symptoms of dehydration, fever, diarrhea, as well as loss of weight and tiredness. It can be prevented by practicing good personal hygiene, that is bathing every day, making sure that you wash your hands after visiting the toilets, making sure that you do not cough, sneeze over food, and if you have coughed, you cough and then you go and have to wash your hands. It is separating food. You learned in grade 10 about cross-contamination where raw and cooked food needs to be stored separately, cooking food properly, keeping rubbish in a closed dustbin, because we know that flies can get can go from the bin and go into food and ultimately then contaminating the food. Therefore, you need to ensure that the bin is far away from the food preparation area. And also an employee that has gastroenteritis, they should not be allowed to handle any food. Now, cholera is an intestinal infection caused by bacteria. But cholera is mostly prevalent in areas where they source their water from a river, or communities that drink water that is untreated. It is transmitted by drinking contaminated water, eating food that is washed by contaminated water, handling food with dirty hands. Um, a person can go fishing from a river which has been contaminated, and then when they fish and the person consumes that fish, they can ultimately get sick. And then also, if you are growing fruits and vegetables and you water your garden with water from the sewage, that can cause cholera. It takes about 4 days for the symptoms to surface, and you have symptoms of watery stools, a rapid heart rate, muscle cramps, as well as the others that I've mentioned at the beginning. It is important for you to always treat all the liquids to prevent the transmission of cholera. You can add a drop of jig or a teaspoon of jig to 1,000 liters of water to really treat that water. You need to boil all liquids. You learned in grade 10 that if you boil water to 100 degrees Celsius, all bacteria dies. You need to avoid raw or undercooked food, so food must be cooked thoroughly. You need to always wash your fruits and vegetables with treated water and not wash them with the untreated water. Now we're going to look at HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis as our infectious diseases. HIV and AIDS is transmitted through a retrovirus that weakens the immune systems. It can also be transmitted through the exchange of body fluids, which can be blood or semen, through practicing unsafe sex, through receiving contaminated blood through blood transfusions, as well as sharing injections or needles. A person can show symptoms of swollen glands, cracked mouth corners, thrush in the mouth, rapid weight loss, swollen lymph glands, white spots on the tongue or in the throat, as well as diarrhea, tiredness, loss of weight, night sweats, etc. It can be prevented by abstaining from sex or using safe sex practices, as well as avoiding sharing needles. Now, what is also important for me to highlight here, learners, is that a person with HIV and AIDS cannot be restricted from work, because it cannot be transmitted by sharing spoons or working in the same environment as that person. However, once a person starts to display any infections or illnesses such as diarrhea, and tiredness or weakness, then that person can be asked just to stay at home for a few days until they get better. And if a worker cuts themselves with a knife or they get burnt in the kitchen, then their fellow employees should use gloves to treat that person, and that person should essentially wear gloves throughout the whole preparation period. Tuberculosis is transmitted by inhaling drops of sputum sprayed into the air when an infected person speaks, coughs, or sneezes. Okay, can also be transmitted by a person who drinks unpasteurized milk. On top of the other symptoms, a person with tuberculosis can display symptoms of coughing for more than 3 weeks. They can cough up blood, they can have a shortness of breath, they can have night sweats, etc. A person definitely needs to go on sick leave when they've got tuberculosis, because it is now spread from the air. If any air droplets go into another person, they can easily be infected. They need to be on treatment before they go into work, because once they are on treatment, then it doesn't become contagious after a few weeks, and then they need to use pasteurized products. What impact does these diseases have on the workforce? It lowers productivity. There is a workflow. and everybody's got their job and their own job descriptions and their own responsibilities. Now, if you've got one worker that has been affected or infected by any of these diseases, it will slow down the workflow, therefore lowering productivity. Where in the restaurant, the orders will take long to come out, because now you would find that you have one worker that is doing a job of two people if two people are off sick and etc. Absenteeism. If a person's got gastroenteritis and they have diarrhea, they need to stay at home. If a person's got TB and while they are seeking treatment, they need to stay at home. Now, that absenteeism will also now lead to lower productivity. If a person has to stay home, especially someone with TB has to stay at home for about 3 to 6 months, now vacant posts need to be opened up, because you cannot have lower productivity, because you are in the service industry, and customers are paying for a service. So you have vacant posts where you need to be replacing the worker. Even in the event where the person passes away, you need to replace them, and that means that you have to retrain, you have to rehire new people, which will essentially cause a loss of income, because now you're paying more money to retrain and rehire new employees. Okay, that was very short. That's the end of it. Now let us look at how these diseases can be assessed in a question paper. You will mostly have it in a scenario-based question. Let us look at the first one. It says a popular resort gets its water from a nearby dam. It is suspected that there is an outbreak of cholera in the area. Some of the guests have displayed typical symptoms of cholera and have been hospitalized. The manager has requested the health authorities to investigate the matter thoroughly to prevent the disease from spreading. Now, let me first just explain. You sometimes get very lucky where the examiners will give you the name of the disease. Okay, and you will then answer according to now this disease. Sometimes they might just give you an extract or a scenario where they won't mention the disease but will mention symptoms, and you must be able to identify the disease. But we'll see that in our next example. Now, the first question will be state 4 symptoms of cholera. Now, remember, we only looked at the 3 dominant ones. In this instance, because they have not given you any symptoms in the activity, you can now also add on to the most dominant ones, the ones that overlap or that are the same as all the other diseases. Watery diarrhea, dehydration, nausea, vomiting, a rapid heart rate, dry mouth, and low blood pressure will be any of the answers that you can write, which is out of 4 marks. Let's look at the second one. Explain how the water from the dam. Remember, it has been stated in the extract that this resort gets its water from the dam. So the question is explain, so you must write in 4 sentences how the water from the dam could have contributed to cholera. Your answer will have the following. The guests will consume food that was prepared and cooked with water that was contaminated. Now remember, the water wouldn't have been treated, because it does say that the guests have displayed the symptoms, which means that they've cooked and they've given these guests beverages which has been prepared by the contaminated water, and then the guests drinking the contaminated water. Okay, let's look at the second extract or scenario. It says the Department of Health has urged all residents to employ good personal hygiene, like washing hands with soap and water after using the toilets and before eating. This highly infectious disease causes the liver to swell. It is reported to be more prevalent in areas where hygiene and sanitary conditions are poor. Now, boys and girls, if you look at this now, second example, there's been no mention on the type of disease, but they've told you that the disease is infectious. They have outlined to you that it causes the liver to swell. They have outlined the fact that people or residents need to wash their hands, they need to practice good hygiene, and they need to make sure that the water they're consuming before they're eating is clean. And it also now tells you that this disease is prevalent, so it's more common in areas where there's a problem with hygiene and sanitary conditions. Okay, so now that makes you think, which disease? Now, the first question says, name the disease mentioned in the article. So you need to now look at the keywords, and it's right there. It says liver to swell, which makes it hepatitis A. The next question, describe 3 symptoms that affected residents could have experienced. So any 3 symptoms that they could have experienced. Now again, they have not told you anything about the symptoms because it's a higher order question where you must first identify the disease, and then now you must now think which symptoms will this disease that you've identified in A person will show symptoms of. Okay, and the answers that you would have to write are dark yellow urine, yellowish eyes and skin, which is your jaundice, tiredness, an upset tummy, loss of appetite, diarrhea. You can even add here dehydration, because when you've got diarrhea, you can become dehydrated. Okay, let's look at the third one, boys and girls. You will get a copy of this, of the worksheets. Gastroenteritis and TB are 2 of the reasons for the high rate of absenteeism in the food and beverage industry in South Africa. They are giving you the diseases. They are telling you it's gastroenteritis. They are telling you it's TB. Now the question is, what is the incubation period of gastroenteritis? So now they're not focusing on the TB for now. They want you to speak about the gastroenteritis. So you would have to write 24 to 48 hours. You can also write 2 to 3 days. Then the second one, explain how a food handler may prevent gastroenteritis from affecting others in the workplace. So you as an employee have been contaminated with this gastroenteritis disease. Now, how must you prevent spreading it into other fellow employees in the workplace? Now, the action verb there, boys and girls, is explain. All right, so you need to explain in detail. So the answers that you would write would be, food handlers with gastroenteritis should inform the employer as soon as possible. Because now remember, we said that if someone's got gastroenteritis, they should stay at home. You should not work if you've got diarrhea. You should maintain good personal hygiene. Wash hands after using the toilet, after touching the rubbish bin, after touching your body, your hair, your nose, etc. You should wash and sanitize equipment and surfaces after handling raw meat and poultry. It continues. You need to ensure that the food is thoroughly cooked, especially chicken, fish, and eggs, because gastroenteritis, remember, is not only transmitted by the person having diarrhea, but also from food. Remember, we said that you have to separate your raw food and your cooked food. You have to make sure that you store food in the right storage conditions and the right temperatures. Insects and rodents, which are your mice and rats, they should be eliminated from the kitchen by installing screens on windows so they do not come into contact with food, because you know from grade 10 as well, they can leave droplets and then contaminate the food. The kitchen should comply with proper storage regulations. Remember, what needs to be kept in the fridge must be kept in the fridge. What needs to be kept in the dry area must be kept in the dry area. Your dry storage areas, you must not put food on the floor. You should always have an elevated area where the food is not sitting on the floor, because even when you are washing or sweeping the floor, that no contamination of the equipment goes into the food. All food should be covered when stored. You must separate your cooked food and your raw food, especially in the fridge. Food should not be stored on the floor. We've discussed that. And then waste should not be left to accumulate, and the lids must be kept on at all times. And we said at the beginning that the bin needs to be far away from the kitchen preparation areas. Okay. Then the next question can also be still relating to the extract on gastroenteritis and TB. State 3 symptoms of each of the following: gastroenteritis and TB. Now, the answers that you'll have for gastroenteritis will be diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, dehydration, stomach ache, headache, or fever. Now, you need to now also remember what I said to you at the beginning of the lesson, that sometimes you might be given the symptoms and they can give you, for example, they can say a guest has displayed nausea and vomiting, and then you'll be asked to give other symptoms. In this instance, then you will say dehydration, headaches, fever. Okay. And then the last one is tuberculosis, a constant cough, feeling tired all the time, weight loss, loss of appetite, coughing up blood, night sweats, chest pains, as well as shortness of breath. Thank you so much, boys and girls. I hope that you have learned quite a lot today, and you will find more activities that will be loaded onto the ECDOE website for you to go through. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in our next lesson.